Welcome back, gang, to another riveting edition of the Pearl Snap Tactical Podcast, the show that gives you the tips and tools you need to make yourself stronger, faster, and harder to kill. In the light of recent events that are transpiring in Los Angeles, I thought I would add a second installment to our study of domestic insurgencies. If you missed our first episode, it was entitled Insurgency 101. I highly recommend you give that a listen. You can do it either before you listen to this episode or after. They're standalone podcasts, but they definitely go together, so you don't want to miss them. You don't want to miss it. So make sure you listen to it. In this episode, we broke down the basics of insurgency theory. Like, what is an insurgency? How is it that small irregular forces use asymmetrical tactics to wear down larger conventional armies or forces? And why the flea metaphor is so powerful to understanding the modern conflict. If you'll recall, we kind of did a deep dive into a pivotal book on the topic called War of the Flea that was written back in the 60s, and and the principles discussed there still hold true today. Today, though, we're going to dig a little deeper into that. We're going to look at how these principles show up here at home in America's own backyard, particularly with the urban riots of 2020. That's going to be our backdrop because that's the one we have a lot of more data on. The stuff that's going on in LA, we're going to talk about that too, but it's still very early so that battlefield is still being shaped, so to say. So we're going to unpack what the mainstream media called the quote-unquote mostly peaceful protests, and were in fact guerrilla-adjacent tactics that were being deployed in U.S. cities. Now, that's a trigger word there. I'm not saying that those groups were guerrilla fighters, but I would certainly consider them guerrilla-adjacent. That is, that they are adopting tactics that are used by their predecessors in armed conflicts, right? So it's the same type of principle. It's just looking different as it gets played out here at home. And so we're going to talk about how those were deployed inside our U.S. cities and what that could mean for us going forward, especially as we are now watching some of these things that are very similar play out in L.A. But before we do that, I want to give a quick shout out to our premium subscribers on Substack. Guys, I really appreciate your support because it definitely keeps this show going. Could not do it without you. And if you're interested, if you're not on our Substack already, you can get a free account. You'll get access to all of the episodes except for the members only content. To that, you got to pay the piper a little bit. You got to pull it out of the wallet and dump a little coin in to help us keep the lights on. So if you'd like to do that, there's a simple tab. You just hit upgrade now, and boom, for a couple bucks a month, you're inside and you get access to all of the episodes plus members only content. So without further ado, we're tackling the American Insurgency inside the Guerrilla's Handbook on this week of the episode of the Pearl Snap Tactical Podcast. And we're starting right now. All right, and we are back. Thanks for joining us this week. Man, speaking of the week, it's been a doozy. In fact, to mark this momentous occasion, I had to dip into the 15-year-old Glenfiddich single malt scotch for this one, boys, because this one's a heavy hitter. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is, let's talk about what exactly does it mean to be a guerrilla? What in the world is that? I want to do that before we talk about modern actors like Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and the current conglomeration of those that are protesting the ICE raids in Los Angeles. So let's quickly revisit what defines the guerrilla in the classical sense, right? I'm talking about in the conventional sense. Think of like armed revolutions, things like Vietnam, Che Guevara, Cuba, that kind of stuff. So a guerrilla is typically a lightly armed, irregular fighter who uses unconventional tactics. So things like ambushes, sabotage, hit and run tactics that are used against a stronger, more conventional force. So, as I talked about in that initial episode, Insurgency 101, the goal is not to win outright battles, right? It's to wear down the enemy's will, to fight, to disrupt their control, and to build political legitimacy among the population, among their base of support. So remember that insurgent groups operate according to three principles: to space, time, and will. So the group does not do pitched, highly concentrated force battles, right? They spread out, they disperse, right? That makes it harder for the conventional force to track them and to keep up with them. They spread out, and they spread out so that they buy time, right? Because the longer that they're able to survive, that gives them the time to wear down and to break the will of the conventional force, the governmental force most of the time, and then to also build, like I said, political legitimacy amongst the population. So historically, guerrilla warfare has played out in jungles, mountains, rural areas. So we're thinking like Mao's Red Army in China, the Viet Cong in Vietnam, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan back in the 80s, right? That's kind of what we think of, or used to, at least when we think about guerrilla fighters. That's like in the textbook sense. These fighters are using terrain to their advantage, and they operate in oftentimes small autonomous cells to avoid any direct confrontations, because usually when they get into direct confrontations, they usually lose those. So let me ask you this. So if you're hearing this and you're wondering, like, how do jungle fighters relate to protests in your city, hold tight, because the connection's coming up. And I want you to ask yourself, what does terrain look like in my environment? Right? I'm not in a mountain range or dense jungles of Indochina. So, the terrain is different, but what is the key terrain in my city? What are those contested areas that might mean something? Even if it's not necessarily tactical per se, it could be symbolic. So it's a symbolic key terrain that could be fought for, right, in the battle of optics. But we'll get into all that. But just kind of stick that one in the back of your mind, and or keep that one in your back pocket, and we'll get back to it later. All right, so let's talk about the urban guerrilla and the new battlefield. So let's fast forward from 2020 to today, right? The battlefield here at home, it's not jungles and it's not a mountain. It's an urban landscape within our American cities, and particularly the big metropolitan areas like LA, New York, Chicago, those places. So the insurgencies oftentimes don't really wear uniforms. I mean, some of these groups have little markers and ways to identify them, but they're not wearing like conventional forces uniforms. But they do often mask up, right? And they do often wear things that will signal some type of group affiliation. But they a lot of times don't carry the traditional weapons. They're certainly not issued out. But they like Molotov cocktails, right? They like improvised tools. And really one of the most important, or I really do think it's the most important one now, is social media. That's the most potent weapon, I think, that today's urban guerrilla, or that a guerrilla-adjacent fighter, right, really has. It's the battle for optics, right? The battle for how things look, and to control and shape the narrative. So movements like Antifa and some of the factions within BLM, they demonstrated, especially back in 2020, guerrilla-adjacent tactics, right? Using decentralized cells, certain ambushes, sabotage of the infrastructure, occupation of territory. I just think of remember that autonomous zone in Chaz in Seattle, right? And deliberate attempts to disrupt city functions, like blocking highways and things like that, to create log jams and just basically shut the city down, right? And so with a decentralized nature, right, no clear leadership or formal chain of command, it really makes it hard to target these using conventional law enforcement methods. Now, in the past, maybe you could argue with RICO, and that maybe there were some things that could have been used that maybe we just lacked the political will. We'll see what's going to happen as the events of Los Angeles plays out, like what kind of tools from the legal system may be brought to bear, other than just rounding people up and probably arresting them for misdemeanor charges or stuff that, probably is not going to go anywhere. Maybe. I don't know. I'm just spitballing. But so let's consider the events that have been going on in Los Angeles. So at the time of this recording, it's still relatively new. Things been kicked off maybe a week and a half, I guess. And, but this is one thing you can take this one to the bank, right? The longer it continues, right, what's the likelihood that unrest could spread to other cities in the homeland, and what might that look like? In fact, when I was putting this together, there hadn't been any major things going on in any other city. It was just LA, and then boom, all of a sudden, like the other night when I was working on this episode, getting ready to put it together, I saw the news that boom, they're already experiencing things in Chicago. So that's probably, the indicator is that's probably just going to be one of many, right? So think about your city streets or your neighborhoods, right? Let's turn this back to you. Think about what you've seen and what we saw in 2020. Let's look at what's playing out now. And then think about your own city, where you live, your neighborhood. So if organized cells were moving through on purpose and coordinating attacks and retreats, like how prepared would your local authorities be? Like would they be able to respond to that? What systems are in place that might either help them like be successful in countering these groups, or what kind of roadblocks and red tapes are in effect that might stop them? And, that's an interesting mental exercise, but it really could affect you in the near future. So it's something to think about. And looking back at other episodes where we've talked about building your network, and building your intel gathering capabilities, your law enforcement is key in that. You need to get friendly with some of your local law enforcement, because these guys know what's going on in your city and in your county. They are very much tied into that. And so you can get a lot of information about what groups are operating or what type of response they're capable of pulling, right? All right, let's talk about media narratives versus the reality of it. So one of the most striking aspects of the 2020 riots, and really even in the current unrest that we're seeing, is the way that the media labels these events, right? Depending on where you get your news. It's really interesting. It's like we can all watch the same video footage, but depending on what channel of outlet you're watching, the headlines, the commentary is going to be very different. So in 2020, the central main narrative that was coming out was that, and now it's kind of become a byword and a joke. In a sarcastic joke, is the mostly, quote unquote, mostly peaceful protests. So even while the buildings were burning and major arteries were blocked within the city, right, people are talking about mostly peaceful. This is a mischaracterization. I think any reasonable person would see it as that. And it really just goes to serve the insurgents' goals, right? Which is to confuse the public, erode trust in the institutions, and manipulate perception, right? So it's narrative warfare, right? To fight to control what people believe is happening. That's more important than what is actually happening, right? It is, what do the people believe is going on? That's the key part of a modern insurgency. So today's guerrilla fighters or guerrilla-adjacent fighters, they're just not on the street, sowing mayhem and burning things down and causing damage and rioting and stuff like that. But it's all done with a view of how these are seen on social media platforms and the news cycles and in the court of public opinion. Now, of course, with any type of civil unrest, you're also going to have additional leeches and parasites that are just there for a good time. They're just there because they want to throw a rock. They don't care who they throw it at. They want to loot and destroy businesses and steal stuff. And they're not true believers. They're not there protesting anything. They're just kind of running under the cover of the chaos to loot and, for self-aggrandizement. But, we're not talking about them. All right, so here's another question for you. So how many times did you see footage? There's not going to be a test at this at the end, so you don't have to have an exact number, but just kind of think back. How many times did you see footage from the 2020 news cycles and hear the word peaceful protests while you were literally watching property being burnt to the ground before your eyes? Right. I saw some. I saw literally a news reporter walking down the street talking about just how awesome and how, for the most part, everybody was really peaceful and was just kind of in this solidarity, and it was mostly peaceful. And it's just one or two dudes burning down the entire city street block while, no one's stopping them, that type of thing. But how was that narrative used to erode trust in the official narratives? So drop a comment in the Substack here, man, or tag me on X. Let me know. I want to know what you thought about that. But now that you've pondered it, here's what would be interesting is, watch the news cycles and watch it from a couple of them. Watch even from certain news items or cycles that, I can't even talk, y'all. Maybe I've been hitting the Glenfiddich a little too hard. I swear I haven't, but it's been a long day. Now that the things in the riots in LA have been going on for a little while, watch a variety of news outlets and see how they're covering it, right? Look and see, are they using some of the same phrasing that they did in 2020, and how's that working out for them? And then, are there any new buzzwords or phrases? Are there any new mantras that are coming out? Because it's not just a complete repeat of 2020, right? There's similarities, but it's different this time. It's more geared around the ICE raids. That's becoming the narrative of, were these raids justified? Was this heavy-handed, the fascist arm of the government coming in and just wrapping up innocent people who are here in search of a better life and, separating kids from their parents and, all that kind of stuff? Is that what's going on? Or is this trying to restore law and order, trying to regain some of the security that the country has lost under the prior administration, as we allowed millions of unvetted people into our homeland? That's kind of what the two sides are saying, right? So depending on what outlet you're watching, try to pay attention to that and see what's being used, what is being effective, and you'll know it's being effective by how much your buddies or folks on your Facebook feed or whatever are mimicking those things, right? So see what that is. Who is getting control of the narrative right now? And, that might shift from time to time. So let's compare some classic, the classic versus the kind of the modern guerrilla, right? So how did these modern groups compare with the classical guerrilla? So I hesitate to say urban or conventional guerrillas, because by default, the guerrilla does operate by, using unconventional tactics. But now there is a textbook, case study version of the guerrillas of yore. And so those are who I'm talking about, like Mao's, the Viet Cong, those types of people, Mujahideen, that's what I'm talking about. So again, like we mentioned earlier, these guys operate in rural or wooded areas, right? In the jungles, right? Out of where they can take advantage of cover and remote areas. They can move in, strike, and then retreat back where they are not as easily found and followed by the government. And their point, what they want to do is to win over the rural populations, either to win them over, right, through by getting them to support them, drawing them to the cause, or just by intimidating them. That works too, right? There's definitely some of that in all these movements too. They want to avoid direct conflict and sustain a long-term insurgency. So now when we go to these, what I call like these urban guerrillas, these kind of what we're seeing now, right? These guerrilla-adjacent type groups, they use the anonymity of the cities, right? That's why you're going to find these things you might see some little sporadic demonstrations and stuff in smaller towns. I mean, back in 2020, we had some in my town. They weren't violent at all, but you definitely saw people wanting to be part of that, wanted to participate and show solidarity. But most of these hot points are going to be in major cities that are densely populated, so that these guys can come out, do their attacks, do their rioting, break stuff, injure people, and then they can melt back into the populace, right? Into crowds, right? Into modern communications, right? They conduct fast, decentralized actions. They rely heavily on media manipulation and trying to get symbolic victories rather than holding territory permanently. Like there's no territory they're trying to hold, right? So if they get locked down and shut down from rioting on one street, they'll just move to another one, right? So it's not, there's no city street in and of itself that's important. It's just the activity that is what they're after. So, all right, so let's think about this. So the groups that we saw back in 2020, these guerrilla adjacent groups, they adapted classic guerrilla tactics for urban and digital environments, right? So they're not aiming to topple the state, right? Like the Viet Cong or Mujahideen, that's not their aim, but they were trying to destabilize, they were trying to create chaos and exhaust state resources, right? That would be the kind of way that I would compare and contrast these groups, right? So here's your homework for this week if you want to. So if you had to explain to a friend who thinks that, these guys aren't real insurgents, right? That's what you're going to come against. Like people don't think, because they're not behaving just like the Viet Cong or behaving just like Mujahideen, right? Those guys were terrorists, right? Those guys were really killing people. Those guys were third world nation type stuff, right? These guys here, this is America. We can't have insurgents here. So if you have a friend that thinks like that, how would you frame this discussion? How would you explain to them the principles of what insurgency is, right? And again, having listened to the first episode I did on this and digested that, like how would you explain this to them in a way that they could understand, right? How would you show that, these guys are not exactly like the quote unquote conventional guerrilla, but they are, we could certainly, they're not like the conventional insurgent, but we certainly could classify them as our version, as domestic insurgents, because they operate according to the same principles. They may not be doing the same exact things, but they're operating according to the same principles and definitions, which by de facto, we could call them that. How would you do that? Because they always say that if you can't explain it to someone, using simple language, then maybe you don't really understand it yourself. And I'm a big believer in that. So, do that not because you're trying to change their mind, but it helps you really understand this material and put a frame to what you're seeing on the news, and you yourself not be so easily manipulated by either side, right? So let's talk about, where are we at? We're going to talk about the importance of legitimacy. So one of the key insights that I don't think I went real heavy into on that other episode where I covered that book, The War of the Flea, but I'll talk about it now, is that the insurgent success really depends on the legitimacy of the state. So when a government loses legitimacy in the eyes of the population, that's the space where insurgents can grow, right? It's about the confidence that people have in the authorities to handle a problem, right? And so when you challenge that, that's the longer it goes on, right? That's when people begin to lose confidence and the government's ability to solve the problem or to control it, right? So in 2020, the legitimacy was severely challenged, right? There were certain groups that were echoing and about, that were going on about police brutality or the, perception of police brutality, political polarization, systematic inequality. You heard that word a lot, right? And the insurgents' goal here, was not just physical control, but psychological and political domination through undermining state authority. And in this battle, this is where we see that optics really do matter, right? Sometimes more than the facts on the ground. Because the conflict itself in time will be shaped by perception, right? How the authorities respond to unrest becomes a kind of theater, except this theater has real consequences. Because here's the key, and it puts the government and the authorities in a really, really tight spot between a rock and a hard place, kind of, because if law enforcement or government agencies are seen as cracking down too hard, right? If they roll in and they deploy overwhelming force, right? If it's just overkill and it seems a bit too much, right? They really could risk alienating the moderate majority, right? So people who might not support the radicals could still be pushed into having sympathy for them if they perceive that the state is oppressive or heavy-handed, right? I'm talking about the general population. You might be like, hey, let's roll them all up, let God sort them out type of thing. All right, well, maybe I'm talking about the general population, right? The people that are, could be swayed either way, or, the people that are just sitting there watching 4 hours of Netflix every night and eating Cheetos and drinking beer. You know what I mean? Like that type of population. So on the other hand, if the authorities don't do anything, or if they don't do enough, if they stand down, if they retreat, if they appear indecisive, right? If they're not consistent across the board, then what happens? They embolden the radicals. They allow the radicals to recruit more people because they're seen as successful. So it signals weakness. And in the language of insurgency, weakness is an invitation to escalate, right? So that's the thing. People want to see, the people who are for law and order, they want to see the government be competent and be able to handle it. But you do run into a problem, though, if the government comes in with the iron hand and just over crushes everybody, right? Then people get squeamish about it, right? Just like, that saying, everybody wants to be an infantryman until it's time to do infantry stuff, right? It's almost kind of like that, I think. So the key component here is that the public doesn't expect perfection, but they do want to see a response that feels reasonable, like that, yeah, this makes sense. This is what I would support. This is what I can get behind. Like, it needs to be proportionate. It needs to be competent. They want to see that the state is in control and that law and order can be restored without tipping into authoritarianism. And again, these are the things that the other side, right, that the insurgents are going to key on, right? Oftentimes what they'll do is they want to invite that overreaction. They're trying to always lure the government into overreacting, because then, right, their promoters, right, their facilitators and the media can say, oh, here we go, here we go. Government's getting authoritarian. They're gonna turn this as soon as they put this group down, they're gonna turn it on us, law-abiding citizens, and lock us all up, and then we're all gonna be living in a Orwellian state, right? So that's a really difficult balance to strike, and insurgents know it. And in fact, like I said, they engineer the confrontations so that they are designed to force overreactions. And when that does occur, they highlight, they'll highlight it. Or if there's inaction, right, the media will highlight that too, right? Or the guerrillas will highlight that through their surrogates, their media surrogates, because both serve the cause, right? And so it's really almost it's very difficult. It puts the legitimate government in a very tight spot. So they really have to they have to really have clearly defined goals. Those need to be communicated to the people, and the people need to see that the government is executing those, not executing people, right, but executing those goals and objectives in a clear and a reasonable way, and that is very open and transparent to the public, right? That's how you keep them on your side. As long as the government remains stable, and the society itself is stable, it's very hard for insurgents to grow. We saw that in 2020, right? There really was an attempt at a color revolution here in this country, but they just didn't have the wings to take off, right? Because America was still, at that time, for all of our problems that were going on, was still relatively stable. And so that is what they are trying to do, is to create instability. So think about the institution in your areas. And when I say institutions, I'm talking about things like your police force, your governmental agencies, the media even. Which one of these, if any of them, have lost legitimacy recently? And how has that opened the door for unrest, particularly if you were living in those cities back in 2020, right? How did that happen? Like I said, in my city, I don't even live in a city, but in my town, we had some of that. We had some of those protests, but strangely enough, even though where I live is in a college town, so the area of the country I live in is pretty conservative. It's a red state, but the town itself that I live in is a college town, so it's pretty liberal, right? But ironically enough, the police department had a really good relationship with the city residences. So even those that were out protesting, they had a good respect for the police. So, and again, because I've got contacts with law enforcement, I polled my law enforcement friends about this, and I asked them, I was like, what are you seeing? What's the temperature of these people out there? And he's like, yeah, they're just, they're doing the college thing. They're doing the rebellion thing, but it's been pretty tame. There's not been any violence. And I said, how is your reception with them? How do they perceive you on the street? And they're like, they're pretty chill about us. They know we're there just to kind of keep things in order. And as long as they do things peacefully, we're not going to interfere with any of that. And so it really was pretty benign here for us, which is one reason why I live here. All right. So let's think about what this means for us. So understanding that urban insurgency tactics, or understanding these insurgency tactics, it's really crucial for anyone who cares about security. You don't have to be in law enforcement or military to need to know this stuff, right? If you're an everyday citizen and you're concerned about where you live, how this could affect you, then the best way, right, just training on a flat range and sending rounds down a paper target, right? That's good. You do need some skills. I'm a big proponent of that, but you do need to expand your skill set, right? You do need to understand how these things work, and so that you can recognize it and see things that are going on in your area, right? Or to see it as it's materializing, so you can get ahead of it. So again, these groups, they exploit chaos, ambiguity, media confusion. They test the limits of the response system, and they operate below the threshold of conventional war. And that makes them very hard to fight with traditional means, right? Especially here, right? It's one thing to fight an insurgency in Iraq. It's very different here because, right, the Constitution, right, due process, there's a whole different things that apply here, right, to folks. And whether you are a U.S. citizen or not in this country, if you are here, you are still afforded constitutional protections. And so, that goes into play. So it's difficult anyway. And then the fact that it's happening here domestically makes it all the more dangerous and more difficult to deal with. So what do you think should be done, right? And I mean, from I'm talking, I know what you might say in your head, what you might want to do, but I'm talking about just from a realistic standpoint, like in the real world, not in some, in some Netflix, made for Netflix documentary. If you were writing the script, what would be done? But real life, what do you think should be done? How could the government handle this? And keep in mind that your idea has to be sold to the rest of the population, right? Who may not think the same way you do. So how do you do that? Do we need stronger police or policing methods? Do we need community outreach? Do we need new laws? What do you think is the answer to this? But, I would really recommend, if you haven't, go read The War of the Flea. It's a short read. It is, I hesitate to call it a book. It's almost like a pamphlet. It's so thin, but it is absolutely packed full of principles on how to identify insurgencies, how they operate, how they're composed, how they're run, and then tons of case studies from Vietnam, Cuba, South America. It's a very fascinating book, The War of the Flea. So let's wrap it up. All right. So I'm glad you were sticking at me through this one. It was relatively short, but this is some pretty deep stuff. Again, I don't do a lot of current event stuff, because this is, last week we were talking about Ukraine, not here on the show, but in the news, 1 week you're talking about Ukraine, then boom, we're talking about this stuff, and then boom, we're talking about China, and then boom, we're talking about administrative stuff. I mean, the news cycle is on to whatever's hot, and they put a spotlight on it, and as soon as something new and shiny comes up, then, everybody forgets about what happened yesterday. But some of these things are perennial. If you look at the episodes that we did on civilizational, cycles of civilizational decline and things like that, there are a couple things that are perennial that aren't going away. And one thing is civil unrest, right? It might die down for a little bit, but it's coming back because we really are a society in decline, right? And you do need to listen to that episode. We're past a point. You're not going to bring this back, right? We're not going to return to a golden age. What we're going to do is actually have to go through this, through all its ugliness, through all its pain, strife, and struggle, and a gut-wrenching heartache until we come to the other side, and then we get to establish a new golden age. Whether or not that happens in my lifetime or your lifetime, the lifetime of our children, who knows? But that's the one thing I'm sure of, because that is what history tells us. That is what nature tells us, right? Just like a human being, you are born as a child, you grow through your childhood, you become an adult, you find the zenith of your strength, your most productive years, you're virile, you're strong, and then you begin to age, right? And then you pass into elderhood, and then finally you pass away to join your ancestors, and that you are carried on by your legacy, by your children. And it's the same way with societies. There is no society or civilization that has ever lasted forever in the history of this world, right? It never has. And it's never going to be, because that is not the natural way. That is not the law of nature, right? So I don't know if you've already listened to those episodes and read some of the books that I talk about, if you've come to peace with that, then man, that's a big stressor off your plate, because then you can just focus on, all right, well, this is the phase I'm in, and I'm going to make the most of it. I'm going to live the best life that I can, and I'm going to prepare my children, right? Because they may live in the golden age, right? Who knows? So anyway, I didn't even mean to get on that tirade, but if this episode did spark any questions or push you to rethink maybe what you saw in 2020, or maybe giving you some insight on how you now look at the things taking place in Los Angeles, how those things might play out. Let me know your thoughts, right? Share it with me in the comments below. Hit me up on X. Let me know. I'll be reading. I'll respond. So until next time, guys, hey, again, another shout out to my premium subscribers. Thanks for your support. It really does mean a lot. It keeps me on target to make these things. So if you like it, thanks. Thanks for your support. Until next time, hey, stay sharp and keep it pulsing.